I had bought my first house in my early 20s and lived all alone. I was content and at peace living alone, and decided to buy a house out in the country as opposed to an urban setting like my apartment had been located in. I had a few neighbors, but most of them kept to themselves, and I did too. The house was a ranch-style home, which meant there was no second floor, only a basement and first floor. The master bedroom was on the back side of the house, looking straight into the small backyard. Then there was nothing but woods beyond that. Since the basement was underground, the outside entry door had what was referred to as a bilko door, which is composed of 2 steel doors that swing out to each side, then a set of steps taking you down to a standard-sized entry door into the basement of the home. I normally don't keep those bilko exterior doors locked, especially in the summertime, just in case I need to get into the basement from the backyard. During the winter, though, I don't really need to get in or out of the basement, so I lock those doors up. Sometimes even in the fall as well. The first 2 years there were quiet, peaceful, and enjoyable. I could walk out my back door and go hunting in the woods just behind my house. I would get up in the mornings on days off and just open my garage door from sunrise to sunset with no issues at all. No one was coming around uninvited or anything. I worked a rotating 12-hour day/night shift schedule, which was brutal to get used to. I often had a lot of trouble switching from night shift to day shift, either sleeping too much or not enough. The work schedule repeated itself in a pattern, though, so it was nice to at least plan days off in advance. One particular night in December, I had just finished my 3 work days of night shift. It was hard trying to fall asleep at night on that first night off, but it was essential to get my body back to sleeping at night again, to change back to the day shift work schedule, which I needed for the following 3 days. This first transition night, I would typically sleep very lightly. It had been snowing outside since dark, which was around 5 p.m. or so. There were a few inches already on the ground by the time I'd went to bed. That was around 11 p.m. I fell asleep within the hour. I woke up at around 3 o'clock. The house was dead silent. I laid there in the complete darkness, hoping I would just drift right back to sleep soon. But after 2 to 3 minutes, I heard a violent banging right outside my bedroom window. I recognized that sound. Someone was trying to open the locked basement bilko doors. I jumped out of bed and ran down the long hallway to the opposite end of the house, where the rear sliding glass door was. The outside floodlights switched on. I switched on the actual lights as well and looked out the sliding glass door toward the basement doors. There wasn't anybody there. I looked a bit closer. I could see fresh footprint tracks in the snow coming from the small path in the woods leading right up to the basement doors. There was no snow on the handle either, indicating someone had just tried to open them. I saw a second set of footprints leading away from the basement doors with a rooster tail, indicating someone had run as fast as they could away from my house. I stayed awake until almost dawn, leaving the lights turned on to the back side of the home. I decided to follow those tracks into the woods at daybreak, but the newly fallen snow and blowing wind had covered them up completely. After I made it a few feet into the woods, I concluded that whoever was trying to break in had probably heard me waking up and moving down the hallway inside the house. They'd run off into the woods before I was able to get to the sliding glass door and turn on the lights. I decided not to call the police, since nothing was damaged or stolen. From that day on, though, I made sure to keep all the doors locked and no longer left the garage door open all day. After all, nobody else was supposed to be around this area at that time. Yet there they were nonetheless. I later sold the house without any further incidents occurring since that one particular event. When I was 16, I lived with my parents in a normal home in the suburbs. My parents were the type to take a lot of trips, both for work and for leisure. They would do so all throughout the year, so when they would go during the school year, I'd stay home and watch the house, anywhere from a couple of days to an entire week. I didn't really mind, and sometimes I even enjoyed it. During this week, my parents were both away for 6 days, so pretty much every night I'd go out and get food from somewhere. It was on the second night alone that I played video games on the computer for nearly 4 hours straight. It was a Friday, so I was staying up late. I didn't have any homework to do, but around 8:15 I realized I hadn't eaten anything yet. I took a break and got in my car, driving to a sandwich shop nearby. It was close to closing time, so I wasn't expecting a line or anything. When I walked in there was a single man standing at the counter. He looked like he'd just ordered and was waiting for his food to be delivered. I stepped around him, and an employee took my order. Then I stood behind the man and waited as well. While I was standing there, I noticed how rugged the man looked. He was tall and skinny, wearing beat-up clothes and having long, thinning hair. He got his order and left, but I couldn't help but watch him leave, intrigued by his unusual appearance. A couple minutes later, I got my own food. I went out to my car and hopped in, leaving the parking lot. It wasn't very busy out, so I got home very quickly. I went to my room and sat down at my desk. I turned on a video to watch while I ate. It was 9 p.m. by then, but I wasn't that tired yet. I was planning on staying up another few hours at least. As I sat there, though, I heard a quick and subtle sound from downstairs. I paused the video and listened in, but I didn't hear anything more. I stood up and leaned my head out into the hallway, listening again. I was still not hearing anything. By this point, I had no idea what that sound was. I wasn't paying attention enough. And it was so quick that I couldn't even really tell where in the house it had come from. Although I was thinking it was probably nothing, I still wanted to check to be sure. I walked downstairs and looked around. There wasn't much to be seen. Everything seemed just how it had been left. As I walked past the front door, though, I realized what the sound was. I grabbed the door handle and shook it, recreating the exact sound I'd just heard. Someone was trying to get in. I quickly looked out the peephole, not seeing anything. I ran around the back door and scanned the backyard until my eyes fell upon a figure. They were facing away from the house, standing at the door to the shed. They were tall and thin. After a few moments, I recognized them. I was positive it was the man I'd seen earlier that night at the sandwich shop. A moment later, he forced the shed doors open and stepped inside. I took this as my chance to call the police. I ran up to my room and dialed 911. I watched the shed from my room window. The operator said officers were en route, but less than a minute later, the man ran out of the shed holding several large tools. He hurried toward the home, heading straight for my back door. I ran out into the hallway to see if I could do anything to stop him, or maybe even flee from the house. I was stopped in my tracks by the piercing thud of metal slamming against the back door. My adrenaline spiked, and in those few moments, I made the decision to run for it. I sprinted down the stairs and straight for the front door. I could see the man continuing to break down the back door. I ran into my front yard and out onto the street, running to the corner of the block. A few minutes passed by before 2 police cars pulled into the driveway and went in through the open front door. I made my way back to the house, getting there just as they pulled the man out and put him into their police car. They'd found him holding a heavy pipe wrench that he'd gotten from my parents' shed. He'd broken into the house while I was outside. It looked like the man had gone on an absolute rampage, destroying everything he could in the few minutes it took for the cops to arrive. Why he followed me home and did what he did is unknown, but the man clearly did not seem very mentally stable. If I had chosen to stay inside, there's no doubt that man would have broken into my room before the cops would have made it. I don't think anyone can know for sure what he would have done to me. It was January, and I was renting out a winter cabin that was by an ice fishing lake. It was a very small, bare-bones cabin, with only the essentials. It was only there for people like me, who liked going out on the lake for fishing or ice fishing. I'd usually bring a friend along with me, but sometimes I also went all by myself. I'd never had any issues with doing that. I had planned out 3 days there with no other real plans in mind, except sitting out by the lake and doing some fishing. The first day in the cabin and made myself at home, brewing some hot coffee and relaxing by the fireplace for most of the afternoon. This cabin was only a single room, so the bed, fireplace, and everything else was all in one area. Anyway, I fell asleep quite early and woke up at around 7 a.m. I wanted to head out to the lake in the morning. It was about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, down a short forested path that was entirely covered in snow. Once I reached the lake area, I found a good spot and got my things situated. I drilled into the ice and started my fishing. I find it to be really stress-relieving to just sit there and fish all day. I know a lot of other people find it to be boring, though. I stayed on the lake for several hours, probably at least 4, then packed up my things. The snow was really starting to pick up, and the wind was getting heavier and heavier. I walked off the lake and back onto the path. Immediately, I noticed something curious, a set of footprints in the snow, going alongside mine from earlier. They went right up to the edge of the lake I was at, then turned around and went back down the path toward the cabin. I was feeling a little uneasy suddenly. Someone was out there and had been right behind me, maybe watching me. I chose to follow those prints and see where they led to. They mostly went along with the path, going right back to the cabin. Instead of going up to it, though, they suddenly veered off into the woods. As far as I could see, they continued in a perfectly straight line, going through the trees. I was even more confused and slightly nervous now. I went back inside the cabin and warmed up by the fireplace. There was nothing else out here for miles from what I was aware of, so anyone being out here was just odd, especially when it was snowing so heavily in the winter. I made food and stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, keeping the fireplace running. I was mostly just doing some reading. About an hour after sunset, I heard movement outside, a very light crunching in the snow, but in the I moved over to the window and looked. Instantly, I saw a figure out by the trees, walking toward the path. They were wearing this thick black clothing, covering every part of them. It made it hard to get any details about what they looked like. Once they got onto the path, they turned and started coming right for the cabin. I ducked my head down now, just listening to the footsteps getting closer and closer until they were right up to the wall. The footsteps moved to the side, coming right up to the window I was hiding under. Their shadow moved around, like they were peering inside the cabin. Then they stopped all of a sudden. I tilted my head to look up and see what was going on, only to find their eyes staring right back at me. I jumped away, now standing a few feet away from the window. The person tried to lift it open. I ran and grabbed a nearby knife. Still, they tried to open the window. After a few failed attempts though, the person ran off. I watched their figure disappear into the snowy woods, going in the same direction I'd seen them come from earlier. After that, I packed up and ran to my car, leaving the area only a few minutes later. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but they knew I was staying there after seeing me at the lake and willingly came back in the middle of the night to try and break in through the window. They definitely had something horrible in mind for me. Luckily, I got out unharmed, but I have a feeling that night was close to being my last. This happened in January of 2020 when I was 18. Over winter break, I had signed up for DoorDash since a couple of my friends were also doing it. I didn't really need the money as I was in high school and still living with my parents, but it was more to just have something to do. As a kid, a couple $100 a week was pretty damn nice. The first few nights went smoothly. I got the hang of it after the first 3 or 4 orders, and after that it was all just the same sort of work cycle. During my second week, I started working more, getting excited about making money for the first time. I tried to make as much as I could. My friends were doing the same. They had mentioned that on days with bad weather, you'd usually make even more. On the one night when the snow started coming down, I chose to hit the road and do some deliveries. For the first hour, I was FaceTiming one of my friends as we were both driving around. He stopped and went home around 8 though. It was a Saturday, so I could stay out as late as I wanted. By 10 o'clock, I was getting a little bored. I took up one more order, I got the bag, and drove to the neighborhood. This was just some regular street with very average houses. By now, the snow had covered up everything though, which made it both hard to drive and hard to see the numbers on the buildings. I slowly made my way down the street until finally finding the right address. It was a 2-story, very typical-looking suburban home. It even still had Christmas lights hanging on the trees outside. I parked and put my hazards on, then got out. I double-checked the bag had everything and walked up the driveway. As I approached the front porch, though, I saw the front door was open. Not all the way, but just enough for it to be considered strange, considering it was snowing and so cold. I figured it was so I could leave the bag inside the house, rather than out in the snow. When I got up to the door, I pushed it a little bit more open and slid the bag inside. Just as I pulled my phone out to take a picture for confirmation, I heard a woman's voice yell from across the house. She asked if I was the delivery person, dropping off her order. It sounded like a young woman, maybe even in her early 20s. Yeah, I put it right here in your doorway. I was not expecting any conversation. The woman responded right away. She asked if I could push the door open and bring the bag inside to her. I knew it was strange to be asking me to go in their house, but I pushed the door open just to see where they were. Past the entrance, there was this long hallway that led to what I assumed to be the kitchen. On the wall, I could see the clear shadow of the woman, who was presumably standing around the end of the corner. Where do you want me to bring it? There was a long moment before the woman responded. She leaned half of her body around the corner and showed herself at the end of the hallway. She urged me to bring it on over to her and gestured with her hands for me to come inside. Then she slipped back around the corner and out of sight. I realized that the shadow outline on the wall had not moved with her. It was someone else's shadow, standing somewhere by her around the corner. I stood there for a second as I felt blood rush through my body. I quietly placed the bag down and took a few steps back before turning and rushing away from the house. I stumbled into my car and glanced back at the home. As I pulled away, in the front window, the figure of a large man approached and watched my car as I left. I stopped at a nearby gas station to catch my breath and rethink everything that just happened. It was pretty clear by how everything played out that this was some kind of a trap. I also knew the police would have nothing but my word to go off of. I did end up reporting it, but when they went to the house to ask the woman about what happened, she denied that anyone else was there. They denied the officers access to search the home for anyone else too. Like I said, the police were unable to do anything at the time. What the woman and the man were trying to do by getting me inside their house is unknown. I can only imagine they would have robbed me at the least, and at the worst, I wouldn't be here right now. I've been a police officer for my county for almost a decade now. I've seen some crazy and disturbing things, sometimes making me question why I even chose this career path. What happened on this night, though, still sticks with me and is often the event that I think about the most. It was nearing the end of winter, but where I'm located, it always stays cold until about mid-spring. This night, I was set to be on patrol of the major highway for most of my shift. On a typical night, I would stop maybe 2 or 3 cars for speeding. Otherwise, not much would happen. Sometimes a call for backup would come in, but usually I was driving along the highway, doing the usual circle. That was when I passed a car on the side of the road that hadn't been there before. It's of the highway. I didn't see it until I was already passing by. Circle, taking about 15 minutes before I got back to where I'd seen it. Broken down vehicle. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. I wasn't in a rush. I pulled in behind it, parking about 15 feet away, and leaving my headlights on. I called in to report that I was investigating a presumably empty vehicle on the side of the southbound highway. I got out with my flashlight and walked up to the car. My first impression was of how old it looked. It looked like something from the 80s and was rusted all over, dents and scratches throughout. I walked up to the driver's side window and held my flashlight up. Nobody seemed to be inside. As I glanced around, I happened to notice some worrying signs, though. There was a pile of clothes in the back seat that looked like they belonged to a young woman. The way they were scattered around, though, didn't look right. I moved over to the other side of the vehicle, but a faint sound from behind me caught my attention. I quickly turned and pointed my flashlight into the woods surrounding the highway. Immediately, the sound stopped, but I'd heard enough to know it was footsteps. Someone was walking out there watching me. I yelled out, directing them to move into the light with their hands raised. A moment passed by and I called out again. There was no response. Everything was silent. I felt my heart beating in my chest as I called in to update on the situation and get some backup to come. I stood there staring into the woods. If something had happened in this car, there would be reason for whoever was out there to try and stop me from finding out. I drew my firearm and moved further behind the car, keeping an eye on that tree line. The next 5 minutes were brutally nerve-wracking. Finally, another officer pulled onto the scene. Right away, I heard footsteps sprinting into the woods. We immediately got to searching the rest of the vehicle. It was clear that something bad had gone down here. But searching the woods in the middle of the night with someone likely dangerous out there was not a safe option. Along with indicators of violence, we found an empty ammo package. It was likely they had a firearm on them. Knowing someone was out there watching me the whole time, maybe even having me in the sights of their weapon, was one of the most unnerving things to even think about. The following day, we were able to get some more information and run a more thorough investigation. The car was untraceable. Although some shoe prints were found in the woods, they faded out pretty quickly, without any direction. What really happened in that car that night still remains an open case. The clothes were suspected to belong to a woman who was reported missing. But with no leads on who that suspect was, it's just left me unable to stop thinking about it. I'm a 24-year-old male, and a few years ago I picked up a job at a local grocery store. I was doing community college and just wanted some money to help pay for food and going out with friends. After a couple of months of working there, I started to get used to the regular customers that came in. Most of them were nice and otherwise average people, but this one guy always had something weird about him. He came in most nights around 9 p.m., which was an hour before closing. He would walk around the store for a long time, before eventually returning with 1 or 2 items and checking out. For how long he would spend walking around every night, it was really weird that he'd always only end up with a couple of things. He didn't ever talk much, but I assumed he was living on the streets or out of his car. That would explain why he only ever got a few things, and his clothes were never clean. He just kinda looked unkempt all around. Anyway, this went on for several weeks, if not months on end. I never thought too much of it after a while, because it was such a normal part of work now. One night he came in as usual, but instead of walking around the store, he came right up to the register. I asked if he needed help with anything. The man just kinda looked at me for a second, before asking if I drove an old Toyota that was out in the parking lot. I immediately found it a bit weird that he would know that, but I said yes because I didn't see where this was going. I thought maybe there was something wrong with my car. Instead, the man kept a straight face and walked away immediately. Obviously, this was really weird. I asked my coworker to watch over the registers for a moment. I went out to the front of the store and looked out into the parking lot. My car was right where I'd parked it and didn't seem to have anything wrong with it. I went back inside to the register, thinking I would ask the man when he came to check out, but he never did that night. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him ever coming like he usually would. When I left, I checked all around my car and nothing seemed off about it. It left me totally confused as to what that was all about. The next day, I planned to ask the man again, but he didn't come in for the whole next month. The man never showed up again. I was just left to wonder why he'd asked about my car seemingly out of nowhere and for no reason. On a Saturday night, I clocked out of work as usual. This was the one night of the week where I'd be the only cashier. So at the end of the night, I was always left by myself. When I began walking through the parking lot toward my car, I got this real strange feeling in my gut. I just remember something feeling wrong. Maybe there really was some intuition about something. It was really unnerving me. I walked quickly and got in my car, glancing around the lot. It was pretty much empty and had nothing to give me reason to believe that something was wrong at all. I turned my car on, and just before I put it in drive, I heard the slightest sound from right behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the mirror that was facing my back seat. I left the car running as I sprinted out and stood a few spaces away, looking at my window to the back seat. I could see a figure moving around. I turned and ran for the store, going back in and calling the police. By the time they arrived, my car was empty. There was no signs of forced entry either, so they had to have some illegal key copy or something. Or I'd have to have left the doors unlocked by accident. I'm fairly certain it was the strange man from weeks ago. But I didn't know why if it was him though. Maybe he had been trying to get in there for the entire month I hadn't seen him, and was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors. I think that I locked them that night, but every once in a while I do forget without even knowing, so I can't write that off completely. The man that was back there clearly wasn't just trying to rob the vehicle. He even tried to stay hidden after I'd gotten in and turned it on. It's horrifying knowing that I was so close to having left that parking lot and drove away unknowingly with the person in the back seat. Once we'd left, who knows what would have happened. They might have waited until I pulled into my house, or I may have never even gotten home that night.